I left my home when I was 12. This is what happened. Growing up, my family dynamic was complicated. My father, Mike, was a stern man, a former military officer who believed in discipline and order. He had high expectations and little patience for what he considered weakness. My mother, Linda, was softer but often drowned in Mike's shadow. She tried her best to keep peace in the household, but the constant tension between them often made the home feel suffocating. Then there was my older brother, Jason, who always seemed to be the favorite. He was the golden child, excelling at everything he did: sports, academics, you name it. I felt like a ghost in my own home, often overlooked and neglected. As a child, I sought validation wherever I could find it. I joined clubs, tried various sports, and even attempted to emulate Jason's successes, but nothing seemed to work. I would watch my parents beam with pride as Jason brought home trophies and awards while I received nothing but casual indifference for my efforts. I felt like I was constantly competing for a spot in a family that had already decided who was worthy of love and attention. By the time I turned 10, the emotional toll began to weigh heavily on me. My father would often belittle my attempts at sports or academics, claiming I was just wasting my time. "You'll never be as good as your brother," he would say, the words cutting deeper than any physical wound. It felt like I was fighting an uphill battle in a war I could never win. At school, things weren't much better. Why? I was introverted by nature. My peers were busy forming bonds and friendships that I struggled to connect with. I was teased for being awkward and quiet, and the isolation only reinforced my feelings of worthlessness. I tried to reach out to Jason for help, but he was too absorbed in his own life to notice my struggles. I would often sit alone in the cafeteria, watching others laugh and bond while I nibbled on my lunch in silence. The more isolated I felt, the more my home became a source of despair. I remember nights spent crying in my room, wishing I could escape the walls that felt like they were closing in on me. I would lay awake, listening to the arguments between my parents that seemed to be an almost nightly ritual. Mike would accuse Linda of not raising us properly, and Linda would defend herself, saying she was doing the best she could. All the while, I felt invisible. Neither of them ever noticed how their fighting affected me. It was during this time that I met Sarah. She was a girl in my class who seemed to radiate kindness and warmth. Unlike others, she didn't seem to care about popularity or cliques. She welcomed everyone into her circle. We quickly became friends, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of hope. With Sarah, I could be myself. She listened to my stories, shared her secrets, and reminded me that there was more to life than the confines of my home. As our friendship deepened, I confided in her about my family life. I shared how my father's words haunted me, and how my mother's inability to stand up to him left me feeling even more lost. Sarah encouraged me to stand up for myself, but I wasn't sure how. I was terrified of confrontation, especially with Mike. Things came to a head when I turned 12. My parents had planned a family gathering to celebrate my birthday, but when the day arrived, Mike and Linda were too wrapped up in their own arguments to acknowledge me. I spent the day alone, watching Jason receive gifts and attention while I sat in the corner, ignored. The loneliness was crushing. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a surge of anger and frustration. How could they be so oblivious? I wanted to scream, to make them see me, but instead, I cried myself to sleep. Finally, after a particularly heated argument between my parents, I reached my breaking point. It was late, and I could hear them yelling again, words flying back and forth like daggers. That night, I felt an overwhelming urge to escape. I remembered Sarah's words about standing up for myself and realized that I needed to take control of my life. I packed a small bag with essentials: some clothes, my favorite book, and a few personal items. I knew I couldn't stay another minute in that house. I slipped out the back door, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of where I would go, but certain that I needed to leave. The moon illuminated the path as I walked away from my home, the house growing smaller behind me. I headed toward Sarah's house, knowing her family was always welcoming. I could still hear my parents fighting as I left, and with every step I took, I felt a mix of fear and relief. I was free. When I arrived at Sarah's, I knocked quietly, praying her parents would be understanding. When Sarah opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "What happened?" she asked, concern etched on her face. I quickly explained that I couldn't go back home and needed a place to stay, even if just for the night. She immediately pulled me into a hug, and her warmth melted some of my anxiety. Sarah's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, were kind enough to let me stay. They listened as I shared my story, and they promised to help me figure out what to do next. I spent that night on Sarah's floor, feeling safer than I had in a long time. For the first time, I felt like I was in a place where I could breathe, away from the chaos that had defined my life for too long. The next morning, Sarah's parents sat me down to talk. They wanted to ensure that I felt safe and to help me navigate what had happened. I was surprised at their compassion. It felt so different from my own family's dismissiveness. Mr. Johnson asked me about my home life and what had led me to leave. I told them everything about my father's harsh words, my mother's inability to stand up for me, and how neglected I felt. They listened intently, their expressions a mix of concern and sympathy. After hearing my story, Mrs. Johnson offered to help me contact social services. She explained that there were resources available for kids in situations like mine, and they could help me find a safe place to live and support my needs. At first, I was hesitant. I didn't want to be seen as a problem kid or, worse, be forced back into a situation I was desperate to escape. But Sarah's family reassured me that it was the best option. They emphasized that I deserved to be in a loving environment where I could thrive, free from emotional turmoil. Over the next few days, Sarah and I brainstormed how to approach the situation. She was my biggest supporter, helping me gather my thoughts and emotions as I prepared to take the next steps. With Mr. and Mrs. Johnson's help, I reached out to a local social worker who specialized in cases involving minors. It felt like a huge leap, but I was determined not to return home. The social worker, Linda, arrived at Sarah's house to meet with me. She was warm and understanding, and I instantly felt at ease. I shared my experiences, recounting the emotional neglect and the fear that came from living in such a tense environment. Linda listened, nodding empathetically, and she began outlining a plan to help me find a safe, stable living situation. She explained that I could be placed in a foster home or live with a relative if there was someone available who could take me in. As I considered my options, I felt a mix of hope and fear. I had never imagined that my life could change so drastically. However, the thought of living with strangers made me anxious. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't go back to Mike and Linda. The idea of living in a place where I wouldn't have to constantly hide or feel invisible was enticing. But the fear of the unknown loomed large. Eventually, I was placed with a foster family, the Grays, who welcomed me with open arms. They were kind, patient, and understanding, everything my own family hadn't been. The Grays had 3 other kids in the house, and while it was overwhelming at first, they quickly became my new support system. They helped me adjust to my new life, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Transitioning to life with the Grays wasn't without its challenges. I struggled with feelings of guilt and shame, wondering if I had done the right thing by leaving my family. I would often find myself lying awake at night, grappling with memories of my childhood and the emotional scars that lingered. But as time went on, I began to heal. I realized that I was no longer a ghost. I was a person worthy of love and respect. I went to therapy to process everything that had happened. My therapist helped me understand that my feelings were valid, that it was okay to grieve the family I had lost while recognizing that I was no longer in a toxic environment. I began to learn how to express myself and communicate my needs, something I had never felt comfortable doing before. Throughout my journey, Sarah remained my steadfast friend. She would often visit, bringing laughter and comfort. She cheered me on during my ups and supported me through my downs. I shared every small victory with her, from getting decent grades in school to finally feeling like I could participate in conversations without fear. The bond we had only grew stronger, and I realized how lucky I was to have her in my life. As I navigated my new life, I also began to explore my interests and passions. I found a love for writing, channeling my experiences into stories. I joined the school's creative writing club and discovered a newfound confidence. Writing became a way for me to process my emotions, and I started sharing my work with others. One day, as I was sharing my writing with Sarah, she looked at me with pride and said, "You've come so far. I'm really proud of you." Her words struck a chord within me, a reminder of how far I had come from that lonely child in a chaotic household. I realized that leaving home had been the catalyst for my growth. Years later, I look back at my decision to leave with gratitude. It wasn't easy, and there were many times I felt lost, but I grew into the person I am today. Leaving was the first step in reclaiming my life, my happiness, and my sense of self. I learned that I am not defined by my past, but rather by how I rise from it. I realize how far I've come. I'm not that scared 12-year-old anymore, but he's still a part of me. Leaving home was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most important decision of my life. It set me on a path of self-discovery, of resilience, and of learning how to trust and forgive both myself and others. Today, I'm 25, and working as a social worker. I've dedicated my life to helping kids like me, kids who feel lost and alone, who don't know where to turn. I've made peace with my past, and while my relationship with my parents is still complicated, we've come a long way. I visit them a few times a year, and while it's not perfect, it's more than I ever thought possible. When I left that night all those years ago, leaving home at 12 taught me so much about the world and myself. It taught me that I'm stronger than I ever imagined, that kindness can come from the most unexpected places, and that healing is a journey, not a destination. While I still carry the scars of my childhood, I've come to embrace them as part of my story. They remind me of the strength it took to walk away from a life that was suffocating, and in doing so, I found my voice, my freedom, and my true self. That's it for the story. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like and subscribe, please.